In the New Testament, the phrase 12 tribes of Israel is required by the text itself to function as a collective covenantal designation for all Israel, rather than a reference to biologically traceable descendants of 12 literal tribes. Why? Because a strictly genealogical reading fails in the very contexts where the phrase is used and where no appeal is made to ancestry, verification, or any alternative mechanism for identifying tribal descent. By the late Second Temple period, tribal genealogy had already become largely irrecoverable. The Assyrian exile dismantled northern tribal records. Post-exilic Judah absorbed mixed populations. And even priestly lineage was disputed, as evidenced in Ezra-Nehemiah. By the 1st century, there were no longer 12 distinct, socially or genealogically verifiable tribal entities capable of functioning as identifiable units. Nor does the literature of the period suggest that such loss was remedied through any hidden, symbolic, or post hoc means of identification. Nevertheless, New Testament writers speak of the 12 tribes as a present, unified covenantal reality. When Paul declares before Agrippa in Acts 26-7 that our 12 tribes are earnestly serving God and hoping to attain the ancestral promise, his claim would be unintelligible if it depended on verifiable biological descent or on any criterion inaccessible to his audience. Paul presupposes a shared understanding of Israel's identity that does not require explanation precisely because it is covenantal rather than genealogical. As N.T. Wright observes, Paul is not appealing to ethnic nostalgia or genealogical precision, but to Israel's continuing covenant vocation as a people defined by promise rather than pedigree. Source: Paul and the Faithfulness of God, Volume 2, page 1235. This collective meaning becomes explicit when James addresses the 12 tribes in the dispersion in James 1-1. In Jewish literature, dispersion refers not to intact tribal populations living abroad, but to Israel under covenant exile, scattered among the nations and stripped of territorial and tribal coherence. James offers no genealogical clarification, no criteria of descent, and no explanation of how such identity is to be discerned, because none is expected. As Richard Bauckham notes, the 12 tribes had long since ceased to function as a literal demographic description and instead operated as a symbolic expression for the whole people of God in exile. Source: James, Wisdom of James, Disciple of Jesus the Sage, page 23. James's address only makes sense if 12 tribes already functions as a symbolic totality for covenant Israel, rather than as a biologically demonstrable population. The prophetic background confirms this usage. Ezekiel's vision of reunification in Ezekiel 37 is delivered centuries after the northern tribes had vanished as traceable genealogical entities. The prophet does not describe a recovery of tribal records, the identification of descendants, or a census of lineage, but depicts the healing of a covenantal rupture between Judah and Israel. As Moshe Greenberg explains, Ezekiel's concern is not tribal reconstitution in any literal sense, but the restoration of Israel's covenant unity under Yahweh's kingship. Source: Ezekiel 21-37, Anchor Yale Bible, page 759. The same symbolic grammar governs apocalyptic literature. In Revelation, the tribal lists are intentionally irregular. Dan is omitted, Levi is included, Joseph appears alongside Manasseh, making a genealogical reading impossible, and signaling that the list was never intended to function as a biological registry. As G.K. Beale states, the list is theological rather than biological. It represents the fullness of Israel conceived as a covenant community, not as a tribal registry. Source: The Book of Revelation, New International Greek Testament Commentary, page 424. Paul's own interpretive method further requires a covenantal definition of Israel. In Romans chapter 9, He applies Hosea's language of "not my people" and later restoration, originally spoken about the northern kingdom, to those being called in his own time. Hosea already demonstrates that Israel can lose covenant status, be named not Israel, and yet be restored without ceasing to be Israel, showing that covenant identity can be disrupted and renewed without reference to biological continuity. As Douglas Moo remarks, Paul reads Hosea as describing a covenantal reversal within Israel's story, not the creation of a new people defined by ethnicity or biology. Source: The Epistle to the Romans, New International Greek Testament Commentary, page 587. Paul then weaves Hosea together with Isaiah's remnant theology and Genesis's promise regarding Ephraim, presenting Israel as one people existing in differing covenantal conditions, rather than as separable ethnic groups or concealed biological categories. Hebrews confirms this framework without redefining Israel biologically. In Hebrews 8-8, the new covenant is explicitly said to be made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, preserving the two-house structure while assuming Israel's continued identity despite dispersion, mixed populations, and genealogical disruption. The argument proceeds without any concern for how Israel is biologically identified because covenant continuity, not ancestry verification, is the operative assumption. As Craig Coaster observes, Hebrews presupposes the ongoing identity of Israel as a covenant people and shows no interest in redefining covenant membership along ethnic or universal lines. Source: Hebrews, Anchor, Yale Bible, page 370. The author's reasoning only functions if Israel is already understood covenantally rather than biologically. Second Temple literature confirms that this was standard Jewish usage. At Qumran, the Yahad consistently spoke all 12 tribes in eschatological and restorative contexts, without any expectation of genealogical reconstruction, ancestral testing, or tribal census. Jason Staples notes that the sect understood itself as participating in the restoration of Israel as a whole, using 12 tribes as a symbolic designation for covenantal totality rather than as a claim about tribal survivability. Source: The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, page 268. Similarly, John Bergsma concludes that the reunification of the 12 tribes in Qumran texts is a theological symbol of restored Israel, not a demographic forecast. Page 188. Taken together, these textual and scholarly observations make a biological reading untenable. The phrase 12 tribes of Israel is consistently used when genealogy is irrecoverable, applied to Israel in dispersion, symbolism, and defined by covenantal hope rather than bloodline. Any attempt to preserve a biological definition by appealing to unseen or retroactive criteria imports assumptions foreign to the texts themselves. The collective, covenantal reading is therefore not a theological imposition, but the only interpretation that allows the biblical texts to function coherently within their own historical and symbolic world.